I'm Shaneé Yvette Murrain, Director of Community Engagement for the Digital Public Library of America, a national platform providing free access to digitized collections from 4,000 libraries, archives, historical societies, and museums. DPLA amplifies the value of libraries and cultural organizations as America's most trusted sources of shared knowledge. Black women's suffrage to Black Lives Matter, a living legacy, is an invitation to together explore how a trifold partnership rooted in the local public library uplifts the story of Black women, the importance of freedom of the press during uncertain times, and spotlight Charlotte Mecklenburg Library's work to collect African-American COVID-19 experiences and photos from the Black Lives Matter protests and enrich Wikimedia articles with relevant information for and about the Charlotte Mecklenburg community. Thanks to Pivotal Ventures and their support for the Black Women's Suffrage Digital Collection, Charlotte Mecklenburg Library received a generous subgrant for the Engage 2020 Look Back, Move Forward campaign. Engage 2020 is a wide variety of programming targeted to diverse groups of individuals engaging in facilitated conversations around important civic issues about the history of voting in the US, past and current campaign trends, and also spotlighting the history of women's voting rights, especially Black women. As part of this project, the library invites patrons of its digital branch to engage in events, programs, and exhibits that look back at our history and move us all forward toward a better future by, here's just some of them, I won't spoil our panelist presentation, taking the 2020 census and celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Martha Yesowich, Community Partnerships Leader at Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, and Hannah Terrell, Branch Leader of the Allegra Westbrooks Regional Library, Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, will demonstrate how the Engage 2020 project is a political act of remembering in the midst of relentless cultural amnesia, and share with us how the project's associated programming with Black Lives Matter artists, activists, HBCUs, and current women who serve as elected officials is helping the library uncover the ethics of collecting and documenting activism. To meet the needs of communities where they are, DPLA is also partnered with Report for America and WFAE Public Radio to develop local journalism in Charlotte. Catherine Welch, WFAE Assistant News Director, and reporter Alexandra Watts will share with us how their journalism counteracts misinformation and steps they are taking to survey community needs while tracking contemporary voting rights and suppression. Due to gracious support from the Sloan Foundation to bring cultural artifacts to Wikipedia, DPLA's community-supported editor, Nicole Miller, is developing local stories, collecting archival material, and editing Wikipedia articles highlighting the stories of African-American civic women in the Queen City. Dante and DPLA Wikimedian in residence and data fellow Dominic Byrd-McDevitt will talk with us about the power of Wikipedia as information source and systematic bias that results in coverage gaps for articles about Black women. Through this work, we will see communities participating in the construction of their own stories and building new archives for revisiting throughout the life of the community. By building archives, voting, and completing the census, communities are imagining new futures. They're also asserting their right to fair representation. I'm going to share a link to a primary source in the chat. On October 20th, 1923, Nannie H. Burroughs wrote to fellow suffragist Addie W. Hunton, agreeing to send a representative from the National Association of Colored Women to the Third Pan-African Conference. In the letter from the W.E.B. Du Bois Papers collection at the University of Amherst Special Collections, Burroughs says, "I don't know about the basis of representation, but it seems to me that our organization should be officially represented by membership." Official representation. Black women are still in search of that in organizations, public places, and the political process. Now I invite Martha and Hannah to share with us more how they have worked to capture Black women's civic activism and link it to the Black Lives Matter movement in the present. Martha and Hannah.
Thank you so much, Shaneé. We're so excited to be here. Like Shaneé said, my name is Martha Yesowich, and I'm the Community Partnerships Leader for Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. Even before the pandemic, 2020 was a watershed year with the centennial of the 19th Amendment, the planned Republican National Convention to be here in Charlotte, and the presidential election. We have been thrilled to partner with DPLA to tell a number of important stories, from elevating the profile of Black women suffragists to telling the stories of our local Charlotte communities.
And my name is Hannah Terrell, and I am, again, the branch leader of the Allegra Westbrooks Regional Library. And Martha and I did not embark upon this journey by ourselves. We had a wonderful team of librarians that worked with us, and they worked with us, and they were from all parts of the library system. We had teen, children's, adults, catalogers, historians, all were with us marketing to help us with this Engage 2020. We went through a design sprint process where we came up with the theme and slogan literally in one planning meeting. And as you see there, we went through coming up with ideas, and then we narrowed down our process, and we came up with Engage 2020, Look Back and Move Forward. And we were able to brand our logo and this whole initiative, which gave us a center point for us to work by. We know that this 100 years of women raising their voices, to be heard, to be counted, and to matter.
Now, before we get into the gist of our programming and outreach, I wanted to share with you the words of a young poet named Deashana Logan. And we think that her words really capture the spirit and the foundation of our programming.
And in this year's election, I encourage any woman of color to vote, because our voices are, I feel, effective in this day and time, in this era. I feel like we have a voice that's bigger now than it has been before. In Black women, for sure, I know we have made an impact in our numbers as far as education, as far as, the statistics of striving above, the statistics that America has set for us.
Confession. I'm 29 years old and have never stood in line for a presidential election. Yes, please reprimand me. Beat me down with your watered down version of history. Tell me that my vote counts, but never tell me why. Because some thought that putting a Black man in the presidential seat was enough to put a sparkle in my eye, but it wasn't. Until I learned that it was more than just me standing on that election line. I've heard stories of Black women who fought wars far before my existence. It is called suffrage for a reason. In 1920, women were given the right to vote. But it wasn't until 1965 that Black women were given that same privilege. Y'all, that was only 55 years ago. My mother is 51 years old, so that means that my grandmother grew up in a world where she didn't have the privilege to vote. So they are celebrating a centennial. We are celebrating a seat at the table. Picture this. Millions of women protesting for civil rights, and somehow your entire race gets missed. See, I stand on the election line for more than just me. I stand for those women who protested on that day in 1920 and now aren't alive to have that opportunity because it took over 55 years to see the fruits of their labor. I stand for my grandmother, because when she was 29, she didn't have the privilege to stand in the election line. I stand for women like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell. I stand for my nieces, because I will teach them that this is a privilege, one that somebody fought long and hard for them to have. I stand to make a statement, Because a great poet once told me that black women shook up the universe, but it is my belief that our vote will shift this nation. And that's one heck of a revelation. I write this poem for every woman who question what their votes mean. Take a deep dive into history. Because my textbooks only tells me stories about that fateful day in August of 1920. But sometimes history doesn't include everybody. It is those no-name unsung heroes that really push the needle, and who knows? Maybe the next history book can start with me. Whether it be standing in the election line or simply taking a knee, it's always more to the story. And this election is just the beginning.
It took 7 years to get this passed, you know, and it took 7 years. It took, you know, these women, you know, endured a lot to get this voting passed. And so, you know, especially for Black women, we have had a lot of odds against us for the color of our skin, for just being a woman. And so it's definitely important that we express our voices and we express our opinions of who we want in office.
And now you'll hear a little bit more about our partnership with Johnson C. Smith University in a few minutes, but that piece of spoken word came out of the Black Ink Monks, which is a spoken word group at Johnson C. Smith. And we just thought that in partnership with them, this work really just showed what we wanted to say about where we came from and where we're going. So. As soon as we can get the slideshow to advance, we'll talk a little bit about our programming. Here we go. So we started this summer really thinking about setting a historical context for the work we were doing. And we did a series of summer conversations with historians from around the Southeast. Brenda Tyndall, who is the Director of Education at the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, started us off with a presentation called Sister Soldiers, African American Women and the Long Civil and Human Rights Struggle. And then next came Dr. Sonia Ramsey with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And she talked to us about caring as activism and really got us thinking about how there are different ways to be an activist. Her discussion was caring as activism, Black women, school leaders, and social change in the 1950s to the 1990s. And then we had Dr. Marjorie Sproul from the University of South Carolina, who talked about new women of the New South and the challenges that advocates for women's rights to vote faced in the early 20th century South. And next of all came Dr. Dante Bryant with UNC Charlotte again, and his topic was the history of racial progress and social resistance to change. And then we pulled things local. We have Tom Hanchett is the historian in residence for Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, and he held a conversation on women changing Charlotte, which focused on women who changed Charlotte in the 1970s and 80s in the public as well as the private sector, and how those women really changed the city of Charlotte. And that, you know, everything is a progression. And so we really started thinking about other women who have changed Charlotte and how we could elevate their stories.
Excuse me 1 second. And so that brings us to, as Martha said, local stories. Here we have in the upper right, Miss Allegra Westbrooks, of which my library is named after. Talk about her more in a second. And we see a local Charlotte women's suffrage parade from the early 20th century. This is courtesy of our Robinson Spangler, North Carolina room. This is Miss Teresia Elder, public health leader, Her motto is passing on the torch. Miss Elder is a force to be reckoned with. When I first met her, I really thought that I met my grandmother. It was amazing, the love that pours out of her. But she is a public health leader. We also have a park in Charlotte that's named after Miss Elder. Miss Elder is about 95 years old. And they shared with her our website and the pages that we have dedicated to her. And she was absolutely honored and thrilled. And again, as Miss Elder's motto, passing on the torch, realizing that this important work that all of the women that have come before us have started, we've got to pass it on. So we look at the local women here, Mary C. Curtis there, her being a journalist who studies the intersection of race, politics, and culture. We see Dolores Johnson Hurt. She is the current president of the League of Women Voters of Charlotte Mecklenburg, and she integrated Winthrop University. We also see here Miss Maxine Eves. She was the first elected African-American president of the League of Women Voters of Charlotte Mecklenburg. And Geraldine Sumter, she's a civil rights and human rights attorney here in Charlotte. So these are some of the unsung heroines. There are many, many more that we have profiled on our website. As I said a few minutes ago about Miss Westbrook, can't say enough. I am the proud leader of this library branch. We officially renamed it April 25th, 2020. Didn't get to celebrate like we had wanted to. We had a big celebration, but COVID-19 interfered with that celebration because actually we were in the middle of shutdown. And so, but still, as you see there, my monument sign has changed. Press release has gone out. It is official. And that is a picture of Miss Westbrook. She died in 2017. She was about 96, 97 years old. So.
And Hannah alluded a little bit to the effects of COVID-19. Libraries were shut down from about March 18th to June 1st. We were in conversations with Shaneé about how are we going to make this initiative happen when we can't even get into our library branches. And we were also all hearing a lot about the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on essential workers in communities of color. And so we rallied our team together, and Teresa Kane and Sabrina Robinson, and you'll see a lot more of Sabrina's work as we go on, started talking to people in the neighborhood around their location, which is the West Boulevard branch. And so they started by speaking with an RN whose name is Robert Merriweather, talking about being on the front lines as a healthcare worker. And if he can pop up. I think our animations are a little too much for Zoom today. There's Robert. And they also went out and spoke with Ebony Leach, who works at the airport, another location that's cut way back, but was still working. And then a mail carrier by the name of David Blair, working for the Postal Service, still trying to get people their medications and their checks and the things that they needed. So, pandemic programming, what were we going to do? We had this great idea for a series of programs called Engage Her that we were going to do at a number of library locations around the county, bringing in the different personalities of the different neighborhoods, various elected representatives from each neighborhood. But we still today in October have not returned to in-person programming at the library. So we really had to pivot and think about how we could bring this programming out into the community when we couldn't gather. And so we partnered with a number of universities, including Queens, and our honorary chairwoman, Mayor Vi Lyles, who you see pictured there. She's the first African-American woman mayor of Charlotte. And then we brought together again Dolores Hurt Johnson, who you heard from Hannah about, the president of the League of Women Voters, Carolyn Logan, who is a state representative in the NC legislature representing the 101st District, and Jennifer De La Hara, who is an at-large member of our Board of Education. And we had this diverse group of women talking about their path to office and encouraging young people at Queens to vote. And then we took our show on the road to the campus virtually of UNC Charlotte. And our theme there was 49ers Make Good Trouble, from campus activism to the ballot box. We partnered with the Atkins Library archivists, who were able to share a slideshow about the formation of the Black Student Union and student protests starting in the 60s. And our keynote speaker here was a young man named Braxton Winston, who you see protesting there during the 2016 Keith Lamont Scott shooting protests. And he took his activism right to elected office, and he is now a city council person for the city of Charlotte. And we also had a panel of student and faculty activists at UNC Charlotte. And then just this past Monday night, we wrapped it up with diverse women, voices of women in the movement, with Johnson C. Smith University, which is a local HBCU. And we had viewers from a number of other HBCUs, including Atlanta University Center, Prairie View A&M, Southern University A&M College, and Virginia Union University. Here we were anchored by Congresswoman Alma Adams, the U.S. House of Representatives for North Carolina's 12th District. And then we had historian Willie Griffin from the Levine Museum of the New South, Monica Rue, who is the Director of Library Services at Johnson C. Smith, and Dr. Karen D. Morgan, who is the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Smith. And the best thing she said that night was peace, love, and mathematics. She is herself a math professor. And then we had a panel of student activists. You saw the spoken word piece by Deashana Logan. We had a young woman who immigrated from Mexico and is a dreamer, and had a really powerful things to say to people to vote for her because she cannot yet vote. And so this was a really exciting way to bring together activists and expose young people to their passion. And then because we worked with Deashana, because our team member, Sabrina Robinson, is such a talented artist, we started talking about artists as activists. You see there Dakota Ayana, who was part of the Black Lives Matter mural on the streets of Uptown Charlotte. We also had Rosalia Torres Wiener, who is a muralist and celebrates the Mexican-American experience in the Deep South. Alvin C. Jacobs Jr., who was the 2018-2019 Henry Gantt Center's Artist in Residence. And he has honed his craft on the front lines of America's social justice movement. And then last pictured there is Andrea Angie C. Chandler, who performs monologues in a special tribute to the Say Her Name movement. And speaking of Say Her Name.
Speaking of Say Her Name, this right here is, and for the sake of time, we won't play it, but I'm sure you'll be given the slides and you'll be able to see the time lapse of this being painted in real time. But this is original art and original poem, Voiceless, by two of our teen librarians here at my library, the Allegra Westbrooks Regional Library. And this piece is dedicated to the Say Her Name movement, centered on the unfortunate death of Breonna Taylor and all of the other females that are unfortunately have lost their lives. And so that's that time lapse painting of her doing that is right there. And so there were other story times and all the kind of programming that we have done with the Say Her Name. Locking up again, give me 1 second. And so that brings us to, as we continue to talk about art and activism, and we talk about smart activism and ethics of recording. Here you'll see different photos that were taken of the Black Lives Matter and, as a result of the George Floyd killing by police. And these are some pictures that were captured at the different protests. When we talk about smart activism, we were deliberate to make sure that photos or videos extracted from protesters or any public scene preserves integrity and identity of who we're capturing. So this is smart activism and promotes ethical recording. And so as you see there, the faces of those that are blotted out. And if we're looking at them from their backs, that is not as damaging as it is as full front images of those that have putting their lives out there on the line to protest for these important causes.
And we want to share and highlight a little bit our Engage 2020 team member, Sabrina Robinson. She is standing right there behind her twin sister, Katrina. And Sabrina really embraced the ethos of Engage 2020 and shared her talent and love of photography to create photo collections and videos featuring essential workers, Black Lives Matter protests, and more. And you see Sabrina's artist statement right there on the screen. And I just think she summed it up so beautifully. She is an incredibly talented young woman. And we're honestly honored to be able to present her work. We'll see a little bit more of that as we wrap up in just a second.
And as you see there, early voting, bringing it on home, Tuesday, November 3rd, but early voting here in North Carolina has been going on for the last couple of weeks. I am a early voting site, and with our backdrop, which they absolutely loved, we were able to get some photos of those people after they have voted, and all of these photos were taken with the permission of each of the participants.
And I'm going to take over screen sharing here and share some of Sabrina's work with you. This is just the end of a piece called Signs and Symptoms. This particular piece is called Dig Deep. It gives me chills every time I watch it, so I hope that you enjoy it.
You work for me. You work for me. Me and my people, we demand equal. All we see is evil, but you work for me. I've been having symptoms, given by the system. And that's supposed to work for me. Fascinate the system. I know they the sick ones. Yeah, that works for me. They want me to cast my vote. They say hold fast to hope. Then they go and blast my scope. Cause you can't reach what you can't see. They want me to cast my vote. They say hold fast to hope. Then they go and blast my scope. Cause you can't reach what you can't see. You gon' have to dig deep. God bless the streets. Never trust a human that don't practice what they preach. You a beast. Life is a beach. Keep God first and the ops on the leash. All we want is peace. Please give me a piece. But don't pull out your piece. And make me rest in peace. We tired of saying please. Politicians, the opposition, cops is villains. Stop pretending the option's slimming. Everybody's in competition. Ashes, ashes, and black heroes is dropping with them. Can we stop this rhythm? Shouldn't be this hard to put cops in prison. All we need is love, but your heart's in rock position. Toxic conditions, thoughts are conditioned to see darkness and get awkward feelings. How am I supposed to deal with this when COVID still exists? Looking for government loopholes, more cops just shoot holes in innocence. Inadequate stimulus and unemployment benefit, asking the Lord for deliverance. Can't ignore the ignorance. Facts. And that's exactly right, and that's exactly why Judgment Day has come to judge them. Tell your loved ones that you love them and would love to see more of them. All they have to do is turn from sin and learn to love them. Put no one below, above him, and wear a mask. That's all I ask.
So that is the work of Tiffany Too Cool Davis with videography and editing by Sabrina Robinson, Katrina Robinson, and Lillian Assam. Our presentation that I hope Shaneé will share out with everyone is filled with live links to our Engage 2020 content. And I'm gonna let Hannah bring it home.
That does conclude our presentation, and we just want to close by saying thank you to the DPLA for their confidence in the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library to take the objectives of this very, very important work, very, very important initiative, and for over a year, even with the hiccups of COVID-19, stay dedicated to the mission of this project. Shaneé for her leadership and her guidance, and again, just for the DPLA's administration. And again, this is the confidence. This was a passion project for me and Martha and our team. And we just hope that you, the viewers, are inspired by this important work and that we all are changed for the better for it. We appreciate your patience and viewing it and listening today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah and Martha. Next, we'll hear from Catherine Welch, Assistant News Editor at WAFE, and reporter Alexandra Watts.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of this presentation. So let me pull up our presentation. So we're going to talk to you. There we go. So we're going to talk to you just about voting. You know, our subhead was voting rights and suppression. And nothing allows a person to exert their voting rights and tamp down suppression quite like information. And so our objective from the get-go was that the best defense is a strong offense, and to empower our listeners, to empower our community members, to empower the audience of our partners with information. There's a lot going on in this election. We knew right away that how to vote was going to be the #1 story. And so we knew there was going to be a lot of fear out there, a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion, a lot of changing rules, a lot of health concerns, and that once again, marginalized communities were going to be impacted by all of this change. And so, what we wanted to do is figure out, firstly, we wanted to figure out, you know, what do voters need to know? And so we took a survey, Mecklenburg County voter needs, through WFAE listeners. The Mecklenburg County Library System sent it out to their members. We also had our survey translated into Spanish and sent out through our partners at La Noticia. And then we had our survey sent out through our partners at Q City Metro, and got a nice, rich diversity of replies in return. And Alexandra is going to expand more on what exactly they wanted to hear. But we knew right away that voting information was important, and we knew it was important to get that information across multiple platforms, not only to reach these audiences where they're at. If anybody has anyone under 16 in their home, they know that TikTok is the lifeblood of their existence. And so how do you reach those voters there? How do you reach people on Twitter? How do you reach them on Facebook? And so figuring out where people are and then getting the information to them is not only important just to reach them where they're at, but then that information can then be passed along and used as defense and arguments. So for all those arguments going on people's Facebook page, they can say, no, you're wrong, link to our information that is factual and correct, and be out there to set the record straight and to tamp down any kind of misinformation that'll be floating around. That was our goal, was to play that great offense and get it across those multiple platforms. And then just making sure people understood how to vote. Like I said earlier, like the #1 story we knew was going to be how to cast your ballot. We just had the US Supreme Court settle a case on when those absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day, when they can come into their local elections office. I mean, that's just last night. South Carolina voters are still, grappling with the fact that some local elections officials want these voter witnesses signatures to match, even though that's not required by state law. There are 1.4 million absentee ballot requests that went out this year. So you have a lot of people new to the absentee voting process, making sure they understand exactly how that works. And then of course, people trying to figure out how to cast a ballot at the polls in the age of social distancing. And that's where I'm going to hand things off to Alexandra.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alexandra. I'm a reporter with WFAE through a program called Report for America. And Report for America puts journalists in different newsrooms across the country. So there are journalists at public radio stations, there are journalists at TV stations, traditional newspapers, just everywhere. We have 3 Report for America journalists at WFAE, myself, Dante, who you'll hear from, and another reporter. But what's really cool about my position is, well, mine and Dante's, is we get to work with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. So I'm a reporter, but working with the library for like community engagement. So that's a really, it's been a lot of fun. One of the first things that we did was we decided that we needed to do a survey of information needs. A lot of people have a lot of questions right now. And of course, it's our job to present the facts, to empower people, but we have to know what they want to know. So we're just not putting the information out there, if that makes sense. So we did a survey, and then we sent it out to library patrons. And then also we had a survey in Spanish as well that was sent out. The survey covered everything from COVID-19 to news needs to politics as well. And we found that 84% of the people who answered said COVID-19 impact information was very important. 81% said information about what ID you need to vote was important. And for North Carolina, you do not need an ID to vote. So that's why that number is kind of higher. And then 71% said that local politics were very important. So there is a want and a need for information. So based on these results, we covered absentee ballots pretty heavily. I think there was around 1.4 million people in North Carolina who have requested a ballot so far. And there have been changes to that as well. So making sure people had that information, because so much has changed and so much is changing too. I mean, we just had a decision last night. So we're reporting this information. We kind of have to do it very quickly. We also went over how the voting process is going. So what lines look like from different locations across Mecklenburg County, as well as some of the other surrounding areas. We provided information on local bond issues and races, and then what voters need at the polls. You do not need a voting ID. So making sure that they know what they need and their rights and things like that. It's also been interesting because not only are we trying to get that information out there to the Mecklenburg County area, but we're also telling stories at the same time. So that's pretty much what my position has been, getting that information out there, but still highlighting those voices and having a news story as well. So Kat, if you want to press the next. So we have done a lot of work with getting the voting information out. I started in the newsroom in June, and I think we've been focused on elections issues since I have gotten to the newsroom. one thing that Dante and I worked on was the voter's guide. So that basically has all the information, important dates, where early voting sites are, but then we also sent out a survey to everyone running for office, whether that's state senator or soil and water conservation. And we asked them about 3 to 5 questions. And we have those on the voter's guide as well to really help people have that information available. We also have done 2 Facebook Lives I've done, and we spoke with elections officials for the first one. And for the second one, we spoke with elections officials, a news director, and also 2 professors. And those are interesting because we can have those live discussions. So as we're having those discussions, of course, again, the information is out there, but people at the same time can ask questions about things that they want and need to know. Another thing that Kat kind of mentioned is we do have a TikTok. If you're 18 or older, you can vote, and 18 and older, that's different demographics who are going to be at different places. And a lot of that younger demographic is on TikTok. I know of people who are younger who actually get their news from TikTok. That's like their sole news source. So we have a newsroom TikTok that has information from like the voter's guide, but that information is adapted to a TikTok format. I'm not very good at TikTok because I'm older, but from what I can tell is it matches the other videos as well. So we're not just like posting a screenshot of a story on TikTok and saying, oh, we're on TikTok. You have to meet your audience where they are, but you also have to provide across different platforms. So you can have a news story, but then it will look different on TikTok. And then if you go to Twitter or to Instagram, it'll look different as well. Just posting the same things across different platforms isn't really engaging your audience. So we also have Twitter, where we've been doing infographics and tweeting out information, as well as Instagram. We've used Instagram stories. We've done Instagram polls. And those are also ways to really engage audiences, especially younger ones, especially with the polls, where they can really see, like we would ask them, do you know what percentage of people do X, Y, or Z? And then they would answer, and they could see like if they were correct or not. So that was pretty cool. And then of course, I'm a radio reporter, so a lot of things that I do are going on air as well. So my stories are digital and online, but they're also going across the air as well. So we've adapted, it's the same issues, but we're just adapting them to different platforms. And I think that's important because people get their news and their information in different ways. There's so many factors that determine that, but putting out all of the information across as many platforms as possible, they're still getting the same information, but it's accessible to everybody, no matter your age. If you're on Twitter or you're on Instagram, it's there.
And I'm going to toot Alex's horn a little bit because her first Facebook Live with the Mecklenburg County Elections Director and the Gaston County Elections Director got nearly 2,000 views, and it was all just focused on the nuts and bolts of how to vote. So there's definitely a hunger there for that kind of information.
So one of our goals is to get ahead of misinformation, which is everywhere. Some of the things that we've really focused on is how to vote. There have been rule changes, and there are rule changes kind of in real time. So making sure that voters know the most current information about what their rights are and how to cast a ballot. There have been a lot of changes this year because of COVID-19. So making sure they have information on how to track that ballot, how to vote absentee, like what you need, like the specific pens, you have to use a specific type of ink. And I think that's really important because I think every election year or every election, you're going to have questions, but especially during COVID-19, when so many things have changed and so many things are changing, it's important to know, it's important to have that information readily available. We've spoken, we're in Mecklenburg County, but we've also covered the surrounding areas. The Charlotte metropolitan area has a few counties. So we've been monitoring our Board of Elections absentee meetings, both remotely and in person, and speaking to elections officials from surrounding counties as well, because our audience is the whole Charlotte area and also some of South Carolina as well. And one thing to note, because our audience is also South Carolina, which is fairly close to North Carolina, making sure our audience knows that this information is for North Carolina. If a South Carolina voter hears about a certain date or the lack of voter ID or something that's specific to North Carolina, and they think that it's for South Carolina, they're not necessarily getting false information. This is very true to North Carolina voters, but these things vary state by state. So making sure to make that distinction as well, so they're getting correct information that they can actually use. But yeah, it's been really interesting. I've gotten to talk to a lot of people. I've gotten to look at early voting sites. And I've also learned a lot because I am also new to the Charlotte and North Carolina area. And there's a lot there. There's obviously a lot to cover, and it can be overwhelming. I think a lot can be overwhelming, but I'm really glad that we've been able to present the information across platforms, answering different questions, even covering different counties. And this took a lot of planning too. Like I said, I started in June. So we've really been planning for this. I mean, you can't plan what's going to happen in the news, but you can definitely plan ahead on how you're going to cover that. And that's been going on since the summer. And I think that's helped us a lot as well.
Yeah. And then just Alex has definitely kind of, had her head into these issues. And so we've been monitoring what's happening at the polls. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of fear. Now, election day could be a totally different animal, but there was a lot of fear that the passion that was happening on social media around the issues and the candidates was going to spill over at the lines of the polls. And so far that's not happening. And so we've been, there's kind of a saying in journalism is you don't report on all the planes that land safely, you only report on the one that crashes. But in this instance, in order to empower voters with the right kind of information and suppress any kind of fear that would keep them from going to the polls, we recently ran a story that, voter intimidation so far is not really happening at the polls. Alex and other members of the newsroom have been monitoring the regular sort of processing of the absentee ballots, where they look and make sure the signature is there, the address is filled out correctly, as a way to be able to come back and report, are there problems or aren't there problems? And right now we're just not seeing a level of issues that were feared before this process began. And given just the sheer numbers, just getting that information out that yes, a lot of people are casting their ballot by absentee for the first time, but so far we're not really seeing problems making sure that those ballots count in the ways that we all feared before this process started. And then we're just constantly monitoring audience engagement and following up on reports. If we hear of anything that's happening at the polls, we have a channel called Hearken, where people can ask us questions. And we monitor that on a regular basis and pivot on that for coverage if we see unifying themes. And this has definitely been the election season for lawsuits in North Carolina and across the country, and just constantly monitoring the lawsuits impacting the way we vote here in North Carolina. So that is our presentation. I'm going to pass it on to Dante and Dominic.
Thanks so much. Getting my slides started. Okay, so I really want to just set the stage for Dante, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about the theory and inspiration behind what we're trying to accomplish, and how DPLA is involved. And then Dante is going to discuss more about what this partnership looks like in practice, and really get into the work that she's been able to accomplish My name is Dominic Byrd-McDevitt. I'm a data fellow here at DPLA, and if you've heard about my work or the DPLA Wikimedia project before, you've probably heard about this other project that we've really been promoting a lot to the network. With funding from the Sloan Foundation, which helps to fund my position, we're building a pipeline for providing participating, contributing institutions digital assets to Wikipedia. And the reason for this is pretty clear. The mission of the DPLA is includes the idea of maximizing access to our shared history, culture, and knowledge. And so, of course, there really isn't a better place to maximize access than Wikipedia. Just a few facts here. Wikipedia is a top 5 website on the internet. It shouldn't really surprise anyone that it's basically the #1 source of reference information for the world. And actually, cultural heritage collections, images taken from cultural heritage collections that already exist in Wikipedia generate billions of views annually. And DPLA, in the work that we've seen, and in particular with our very active partner, the Toledo Public Library System in Ohio, has already seen millions of new views in just a few months of our project. So I want to talk a little bit about how we actually go about getting content into Wikipedia. So here's kind of the broad vision statement and idea behind Wikipedia. This is a vision statement for the Wikimedia Foundation, which runs Wikipedia. It's essentially this, that every single human being can freely share the sum of all knowledge. What that means in practice is essentially Wikipedia, yes, is an encyclopedia, but when they talk about the sum of all knowledge, Wikipedia is basically situated at one end of this kind of knowledge ecosystem. So at one end, you have the information, which is the primary sources, whether that's the actual cultural heritage artifacts, witness testimony from people who are at an event, or even things like experimental data for sciences, articles about the sciences in Wikipedia. So this kind of thing becomes knowledge by being mediated by authoritative sources, news media, scholarship, things like that. Another way of saying this all, which is all of the librarians already know, is that Wikipedia is a tertiary source. That's a little basic, but I'm just saying that to make it clear that this concept is actually really central to how Wikipedia operates, and it's not just a abstract theory. So a little more on what that means. The central idea means that Wikipedia, the whole framework for how, informs the whole framework for how Wikipedia works. And it's important to understand when engaging with it. So Wikipedia has this concept of neutral point of view, but that's defined as adhering to what's stated in cited sources and verifiable expert opinions, things like notability, what justifies the existence of an article. Notability is derived not from some objective measure of the subject's merit, but actually based on the coverage of a subject in secondary literature. So all claims have to have reliable sources, and original research is prohibited in Wikipedia. So here's where I get to the but, because my goal here in saying all this is not just to give this straightforward tutorial on Wikipedia policy, but actually probably a lot of you aren't going to be surprised, at least in this audience, where I'm going next, because this is all just to set the stage for talking more about why Wikipedia actually doesn't work in this way or doesn't live up to its stated mission, and what we are trying to do about that. So despite all this, or maybe because of it, Wikipedia is not neutral, because I'm sure all of you already know that the secondary literature is not unbiased. Here's just a few basic examples. 15% of biographies on Wikipedia are of women. After many years of concerted efforts to close what they call the gender gap, sorry, that was in 2014. Today, that's 18%. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of Wikipedia editors are men. The community skews heavily white, people that come from Western countries, people that have disposable leisure time to be able to edit Wikipedia, so they're more wealthy, all of these kind of things. So the question becomes, how can we, or Wikipedia, be responsible stewards of knowledge when the production and interpretation of those primary sources and the creation of knowledge itself is not representative? So just to delve a little more deeply, here is the one sentence in a nutshell guideline for what is considered notable on Wikipedia. So if a topic has received significant coverage in reliable sources that are independent of the subject, that sounds very, like, on its face, reasonable and a basic concept of what's notable for inclusion in an encyclopedia. And so Wikipedia could say that they're not placing the bar higher for women or people of color, for example, because all subjects are judged according to the same criterion. But in reality, we know there's a difference between equality and equity. So I'm going to put that notability in scare quotes. And thanks to Shaneé for drawing my attention to this visualization of that distinction. So academic studies have shown that female subjects of articles, as an example, need to achieve more from an objective standard in order to get equal public recognition for their accomplishments. And one study showed that women scholars need to have between 20 and 50% more citations of their publications in order to achieve the same level of notability as male scholars in Wikipedia. So what it means is that Wikipedia is actually amplifying the imbalance of coverage in the world. Just a few examples here. Donna Strickland is a Nobel Prize winning scientist who had no Wikipedia article until after she won the Nobel Prize. Teresa Greenfield, who's a current candidate for major party candidate for Senate, until very recently had no article on Wikipedia. Clarice Phelps is the first Black woman who created a new element, a nuclear physicist, and had an article that was deleted on Wikipedia. There was an article on Michelle Obama's arms, which was a hot topic back in 2009, but no article on Kate Middleton's dress, which received lots of coverage during her marriage. So what all of this means is there are a lot of topics that are notable but are considered trivia by the community, or that are trivia, but like Michelle Obama's arms, but are considered notable. Some subjects that are definitely worthy of note, but are not considered notable according to that policy. So there's really two different issues here. There's the issue of coverage based on the fact that the community is not representative and simply doesn't focus on women's topics or people of color. But there's also the broader question, which is just how can we expect the framework within which knowledge is judged to be representative when those policies and that framework itself was developed by a white male dominated community. So where do we go from here? What's DPLA's role in all of this? What I led off with is still true, that there's no more visible platform than Wikipedia. So we're, through this project, supporting new content related to Black women in local civic activism in Wikipedia. But I'm also really excited by the fact that we're partnering with a media outlet, because it also means that we're supporting the creation of the secondary literature that can establish notability for other Black women and local civic activists that maybe don't yet meet that threshold. So we're not just expanding the coverage on Wikipedia, but also have the potential to change the actual scope of what's possible for Wikipedia. The point of projects like the Black Women's Suffrage Project is to actually try to surface materials about Black women from a collection like DPLA or Wikipedia that are white male dominated. Why are we partnering with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and WFAE? I think it's actually a very natural partnership for this reason. This is actually the first project where Report for America has funded a partnership between Newsroom and a library. But what is the overlap between librarianship and journalism? For me, for all of us, the goal is not just to improve Wikipedia, but improve society. And in the DPLA mission I showed earlier, the actual main verb of the sentence is about empowering people and empowering them to contribute to a diverse and better functioning society. So we can't just improve Wikipedia on its own terms and call it a day. And what I would say all of those things journalism and libraries share is kind of a focus on knowledge in the public interest. So through this partnership, we're essentially exploring a new approach, which is to try to have a positive impact on a community by improving not just Wikipedia, but the entire knowledge ecosystem that Wikipedia relies on. I'm gonna transition over to Dante. So as a result of all of this over the last few months, I've been spending time orienting Dante Miller to editing Wikipedia. And she's also been bringing her journalistic background in selecting worthy subjects for articles in Wikipedia and conducting interviews. So I'm gonna pass it over to her to talk about all of the work that she's been doing.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And so just to kick things started, the first thing I wanted to talk about is the work that I've been doing through Report for America. As Alex and Dominic mentioned, I'm a Report for America court member, and my focus is a little bit unique compared to others. And with this partnership, I work with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, and I work for WFAE and the Digital Public Library to create and fill in those news gaps that people so desperately need. And so I'm going to talk to you about 3 Wikipedia stories that I've created or helped edited and draw you a picture of what I've been doing essentially. And one of those names I'm going to be mentioning is Dorothy Counts. While working with the Wikipedia to create these stories, I assumed that many people knew her name, and because of the contributions that she's done for the Charlotte area, but to my surprise, not only did not a lot of people know who she was, but also her Wikipedia page was not up to par. And so what Dorothy Counts was one of 4 teenagers to integrate Charlotte public schools in 1957. The school she integrated was the Harry Harding High School, also known as Harding High School. And for 4 days, she experienced assault and verbal abuse by the student body and was ignored by the school faculty. After a blunt object was thrown to the back of her head, and her family car was surrounded by a large crowd and windows were shattered, and her brother was inside, she decided to tell her family what's been going on during her time at Harding. And her father decided to take her out of the school once the police chief said that he could not guarantee her safety and that the superintendent didn't know all what Dorothy was going through. I mention this story because after knowing how vital this then 15-year-old girl was during the civil rights movement, before working on her page, I assumed that her page would consist of everything that a traditional Wikipedia page would have. But I was soon proven wrong. And so I should have learned in J school to never assume. And one of the things that was missing was her date of birth. And because of missing information of her date of birth and all that she went through during Harding High School, I decided to go to her alma mater, which was Johnson C. Smith. And I thought I'll get more information from there. But to my surprise, I received her phone number and interviewed her directly. And while speaking with her, she was excited for the work that I'll be doing for her page and correcting the misinformation that was on her page. And she mentioned how happy she was because her daughter wanted to talk to her students, because she's a teacher, about everything her mother has done for not only Charlotte, but also for America in general, to help integrate Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. And of course, she went to Wikipedia because that's the #1 website to go in terms of information. And so from there, I corrected these wrongs and edited this page and created a page that had all her information from the first day to the last day. And not only that, but what she's been doing since her time or after Harding High School. And as I mentioned before, she was one of 4 students who helped integrated Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. The other students was Dolores Huntley and Javard Roberts and her brother Gus Roberts. And the 2 siblings are a little bit harder to find, and so that's my current project now, to help create their Wikipedia pages. Gus sadly died in the 90s, but Javard is still alive, but she's a very private person. And as mentioned before, there was 3 others, and Dolores Huntley was one of them. And there was a lot of information from news articles and interviews that from the past. And so from there, I created her page. The reason why she isn't as prominent as Dorothy is because there was a photo of Dorothy that went around not only nationwide, but around the world. But Dolores's first day was not as eventful as Dorothy's, so she didn't receive as much recognition as Dorothy did. However, she spent her whole 7th grade term at Alexander Graham Junior High School, and she experienced her assaults and also verbal attacks as well. A young boy even wiped his sweat on her while passing the hallway, and throughout the whole year, her family received death threats and horrible phone calls during her time there. And so moving on to modern activism, whenever I close my eyes and think of a modern activist, I think of many, but one of the many I think of is Christy Puckett Williams, and her story is just phenomenal. I had the pleasure to speaking with her and learning more about her and her story, and she is just an amazing individual. She survived domestic violence. Because of her trauma, she was reliant on a drug addiction to cope with her trauma. And because of this drug addiction, this caused her to be arrested because she had 28 grams of cocaine found in her house. During this time, she was 2 months pregnant, and she then received a bail. Her bond was worth $167,000, and of course, she couldn't pay for it. And so from there, she stayed in the prison for 5 months, and she pleaded guilty so that she could actually leave the prison so she can give birth to her twins. However, because there was an officer who arrested her multiple times and he recognized her, he vouched for her and said that she needed help and was a victim of domestic violence. And because of that kindness, she was then sent to a program to actually receive the help that she actually needs and receive the treatment that she needs. And from there, she decided to go back to school, got her associates, her bachelor's, and her master's, and is now a modern civil rights activist and is a mover and shaker for the Charlotte community, as well as an advocate for prison reform and prisoners' rights, and is a smart justice manager for the American Civil Liberties Union in North Carolina. I mention these amazing women because, as I stated before, for Dorothy Counts, she is a prominent figure for Charlotte, and she has been mentioned in Netflix documentaries. However, her Wikipedia page was not correct and was incorrect since 2014. And so how I take this role is to create a permanent stamp of Black women, women of color in the Charlotte area to actually talk about their contributions to the Charlotte community and beyond. As mentioned, he was mentioned earlier during this discussion, Alvin C. Jacobs. He was the first Wikipedia page that I actually created. And while I was interviewing him, I asked, what was an image that resonates with you during your when you attend protests? And what's an image that you continuously capture while taking photos of these protests? And he's mentioned that it was Black women crying. Black women have been the forefront of civil rights and women's rights throughout American history. And how I'm using this role is to create a permanent stamp of their contributions in the Charlotte Mecklenburg area. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you all stay safe during this hurricane.
Thank you so much, Dante and Dominic and Catherine and Alexandra, Martha and Hannah, for your rich demonstrations of what partnership and information collecting for community needs looks like during this very challenging time. We have one question in the question box for Dante. How helpful has CMS or Harding High been in finding information about students who integrate the school district? Were accurate records kept by the district about these students and their experiences in the district? Thank you, Gregory, for your question.
Thank you, Gregory. That's a really good question. CMS has been fairly helpful for in discussing news and information. As any journalist can tell you, just playing the phone call game, trying to get people to answer questions a little bit hard, especially when you try to get answers over 50 years ago. So with that, I would say they've been as helpful as they can be, and that they, if that makes sense, they've been as helpful as they can. And so
I have a question for all the panelists. How have you all found your work in the digital space now changed or impacted? Then, like how have you all gone about creating reciprocal relationships with some of the artists and the activists, and how have you all taken that kind of community building digitally? What have you learned from that transition? Or are the same principles of cultivating relationships the same in person and in the digital space?
I can jump in there a little bit. My primary duties involve creating relationships. And I will say that it's much the same in a digital space, but I think you have to just do more touch points. I feel like Dante and I have worked really closely together over the last 6 months or so, but we've never been in the same room together. So I think we have a strong working relationship. I think she feels comfortable turning to me for advice and help connecting. But I think that we probably have more touch points than we would have were we able to get together. I think partnering in a virtual space requires a little bit more cultivation and maintenance than it does when you're just when you're able to get together for a couple hours to talk in person.
I'll have to second Martha. She's just been an amazing help during my Wikipedia searches and providing information only the library can provide. And so her and Hannah just been a phenomenal help for Wikipedia and the digital media platform.
And I'll jump in too. So I am new to the Charlotte and North Carolina area, and I moved during the pandemic. I got here in June. So my thing has been social media has been really helpful, whether that's Facebook or Twitter, just starting conversations, but also honestly, just asking people who are here, just asking them questions. I mean, there's nothing wrong with really reaching out to people who have been here, who have lived here. Well, who do you recommend speaking with, and making those connections that way? And then you also have someone who can vet for you as well if they're making the introduction.
Thank you, Alexandra. Your answer is reminding me of, how journalists and reporters are charged with going in and assessing the communities and making relationships as soon as you all touch down. And that's something that we can, expand out to libraries and how we do interaction with our partners as well. So it's in alignment. Thank you for sharing that. We have 2 additional questions in our Q&A box. One from Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia. She asked Dante, did you learn the criteria for acceptance to integrate Harding High School? Sylvia says she read Dorothy's page and wants to celebrate your amazing work. She noticed that the siblings and others were not accepted but applied. Can you tell us more about that, Dante?
I asked Dorothy about that and did a little research, but I couldn't find what was the necessary criteria of integrating schools during that time. That's something I'm going to do some more digging on. From what it seemed like, and don't quote me on this, it seems like it was random. It wasn't really determined on age or anything, because as I mentioned before, Dolores Huntley, she was 12 in middle school, and so was Javard. Wow, Dorothy and Gus were in high school. And so, and her brothers were roughly around the same age as roughly around the same age. So I'm still trying to figure that out. So I'm asking that question myself.
Thank you. There is one last question, and I believe this is going to be directed at Martha and Hannah. Are there any proposed county or city policies that the library believes will impact community engagement with your libraries?
I'm gonna say, you know, with the ordinances of how many people can gather, you know, in the space we're in right now, it is an impact. And I agree with everyone that have spoken about being in this digital platform. You know, in one way, we all have meeting digital fatigue. But when it is the only platform that we have in order to engage, then we have to just leverage that and do what we can. And to just piggyback what everyone has said to Shaneé's first question, making sure that, you know, the content that we do have, that we offer virtually, making sure that it is engaging and it is what people want and need to hear and see. So we all have felt the unintended purposes of this pandemic, not able to have people come in freely and in the capacity that they were prior to the pandemic. We are not doing any in-house programming. We're 100% virtual. You know, it saddens us to a point. A part of what we do is, you know, as Martha talked about these different touch points, a part of what we do is being able to connect with people. And we do understand that with going 100% virtual, that's a divide in and of itself. Everyone cannot engage virtually, whether it be through not having the internet access, not having computers. So we are leaving a large part of our community out there. So that part is disheartening. But we can't not offer virtual program at all. So we just have to do what we can to connect as many people as we can with this information.
And I'll just jump in to say that we also just try really hard to partner with the county. Local Charlotte people will be aware of an initiative we have going on called MEC Tech, where we're trying to get devices and internet access into the hands of people who don't have it. We partner very closely with the school system. Every student has access to the library using their student ID number, and then library resources are embedded in their learning modules that they're experiencing through virtual learning. So if they're doing a biography project, it leads them directly to the library to do their research. So we're trying to be as much a part of our municipal partners' response as we can be. But that digital divide, like Hannah said, is just always a challenge.
But then also the flip is, as Michelle said in the chat, she's in Boston, and yet she gets to hear about what's going on in Charlotte. That's a plus. So we're glad that you're here and attending, Michelle. And so that partnership and being able to impact people all over the country, that's the plus. Where maybe these types of programs, as Martha told you in our presentation, are engaged her, they were all gonna be at 4 of our library locations. But because we went virtual, we actually feel like that we were able to, and we know we did, have people that were able to benefit from our presentations and events that maybe necessarily wouldn't have. So it's pluses and minuses, you know, and we work with it.
Thank you. I'm going to check and see if there are any other questions. It looks like there aren't. Thank you all for sharing with us and, demonstrating the importance of partnership and responding to the times that we're in. The Charlotte Mecklenburg Library digital branch and its breadth of partners and your work that sparks collective memory and storytelling around topics of relevance to the community like Black women's suffrage and Black Lives Matter is a model for all of us for digital first programming during this time. This partnership with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, WFAE, Wikimedia, and Report for America should inspire us all to imagine new projects that marry the partner's physical space, whether physical is now at the voting booth, in the grocery store, in the streets, or physical in the digital space where they're combing trusted sites for up-to-date information that's going to impact their lives. And we should all be thinking about how to help engage patrons in personal archiving and storytelling. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to our incredible panelists. I'm going to drop a few links in the chat on our way out. Please visit blackwomensuffrage.dp.la, Charlotte Mecklenburg Library's digital branch, DPLA's splash page on the Wikimedia Commons site so you can learn more about our work, and WFAE's page for NPR in Charlotte. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.